This is the Ridgid radial arm saw, a finely engineered power tool that will perform beautiful and accurate woodworking for the professional and hobbyist alike. The following video merely provides an overview of the assembly and the critical alignment steps. The alignment steps must be followed in the exact order outlined in the manual. This video is not intended to replace the owner's manual, which should be read before attempting to assemble and align your radial arm saw. Observe all safety rules and warnings. Do not plug the saw in until all assembly and alignment steps have been completed. Take time now to stop the video and read through your owner's manual. Welcome back. Now that you've read your owner's manual, let's begin. When unloading the box, make sure that none of the smaller parts are accidentally discarded with the packing materials. The saw itself stays in the box until the saw legs have been assembled. Lay out all of your hardware and parts and consult your manual to make sure you have the right amounts of everything. If you're missing anything, no matter how small, do not attempt to assemble the saw. Contact Ridgid and obtain the missing parts before going any further. Attempting to assemble and operate the saw with a part or parts missing could result in a serious injury to anyone operating the saw as well as bystanders. The leg set is assembled by joining the 4 legs to the 4 upper stiffeners. The side upper stiffeners are longer than the front and rear stiffeners. Remember that the stiffeners always go on the inside of the legs. Each end of the upper stiffeners is attached to a leg with 3 1/4 20 by 5/8 truss head screws, 3/4 inch external tooth lock washers, and 3 1/4 20 hex nuts. At this stage, the nuts should only be finger tightened. The next step is to attach the leveling feet to the bottom of each leg. Each leveling foot is held in place by 2 3/8 by 16 hex nuts. The foot should be about an inch away from the leg. Finger tighten the nuts. Once the leg set is assembled, move it to the spot where the saw is to be used and securely tighten all the 1/4 20 hex nuts with a wrench. The leg set should be stable. If the leg set isn't stable, then the leveling feet must be adjusted. When adjusting the feet, keep in mind that the saw must slant slightly towards the rear in order to keep the blade carriage from rolling forward on its own. Refer to the warning in your owner's manual for a complete explanation. To adjust a leveling foot, loosen the top nut. Now raise or lower the foot by adjusting the bottom nut with a wrench. Snug the top nut against the inside of the leg, then tighten the bottom nut with the wrench to finish off. With the leg set now generally level, but slightly slanted towards the rear, it is time to go ahead and begin assembly of the radial arm saw. The saw is quite heavy and awkward. Therefore, removal of the saw from the box should not be done alone. The shipping boards attached to the bottom of the saw are removed before placing the saw on the leg set. Now, place the saw on top of the legs so that the slots in the bottom of the saw line up with the holes in the top of the legs. 4 5/16 18 by 5/8 hex head screws and the appropriate nuts and washers are used to attach the saw to the legs. Consult your manual to see the exact pattern for the screws, washers, and nuts. The elevation crank is now installed on the elevation shaft, making sure that the set screw is tightened onto the flat part of the shaft. Now elevate the arm about 3 to 4 inches and remove and discard the shipping block. Before installing the saw carriage, the carriage stop screw must be removed and the warning tag read and understood. Do not throw this screw away. It will be reinstalled later on. Also, refer to your owner's manual in the assembly section entitled Attaching Carriage Motor to Arm. Now lock the arm in place. This is done by moving the miter lock lever toward the rear of the arm until a definite click is heard and felt. Holding the carriage with both hands, slide it carefully onto the tracks, making sure that it's held parallel with the arm so that all 4 bearings slide onto the arm. If only 2 bearings slide onto the tracks, there will be excessive strain put on the bearings and track. Immediately reinstall the carriage stop screw. This screw is an important safety device which prevents the saw carriage from rolling off the arm. Read your owner's manual assembly section for a complete explanation. After placing the saw carriage on the arm, remove the 2 shipping screws found here and here. These screws must be discarded. Before installing the arm cap, double-check to make sure the yellow key is not in the switch and that the power cord is unplugged. Put the cap in position and install with 2 1032 by 7/8 self-threading screws. Before the next assembly step takes place, the saw blade must be removed. Begin by making sure the saw is unplugged, then tighten the carriage lock knob. Now, loosen the guard clamp screw approximately 4 turns. With one hand, lift the plastic guard at the front of the saw, and with the other, hold the rear of the guard below the dust elbow. Rotate the guard assembly forward about 45 degrees and remove it. Note that the arbor shaft has a left-handed thread. Take the shaft wrench and hold the shaft steady while placing the arbor wrench on the shaft nut and rotating it down in a clockwise direction. Remove the shaft nut, outer collar, blade, and inner collar and set them aside. The table supports are now attached to the side frames. 2 5/16 18 by 3/4 inch long square head screws are used to attach each support to the side frame. The screws pass through the base and then the support, and the end of each screw takes a flat washer, lock washer, and a nut. Your manual will tell you the sizes for these washers and nuts and which holes on the support are to be used. Note that the support is finger tightened into the lowest possible position. We now begin making alignment accuracy adjustments to the saw. Before we begin, keep it in mind that the arm has 3 indexed positions. The arm will automatically stop but not lock at 45 degrees to the right and left and at 0 degrees. The first adjustment is to the miter arm. Place the arm at an unindexed position and engage the miter arm lock lever. Try to push the arm in either direction with a reasonable amount of force. If the arm moves or if it is excessively difficult to engage the miter lock, go to the arm lock adjusting wheel. Turn the wheel clockwise to tighten or counterclockwise to loosen it. Repeat the previous steps and readjust as necessary. The yoke clamp adjustment is tested by first unlocking the yoke lock handle. Now pull forward on the yoke pivot latch to disengage the index pin. Swivel the motor halfway between the cross-cutting and rip position so the index pin is not engaged. Lock the yoke handle and then try to swivel the motor back to the cross-cut position. It should not move. If it does move, the carriage assembly must be removed. Set the yoke lock handle at an unlock position and tighten this nut with a 15/16 wrench until the lock handle locks midway between the two legs of the yoke. Replace the carriage assembly onto the arm and check for looseness again and readjust if necessary. Do not forget to reinstall the carriage stop screw. The purpose of the bevel lock lever is to lock the motor at any angle, in this case, roughly 30 degrees. Now use both hands and try to force the motor out of position. If the motor moves, or if the bevel lock lever is hard to lock, then the bevel lock lever needs to be adjusted. Begin by removing the socket set screw under the bevel lock lever with a 1/8 inch hex wrench. Now, use the bevel lock lever as a wrench to tighten the clamp bolt if the motor is loose, or loosen the bolt if the bevel lock lever is difficult to lock. Please remember that the clamp bolt has a left-hand thread. To tighten, the bevel lock lever has to be rotated in a clockwise direction. Once the clamp bolt is adjusted, replace the bevel lock lever in the lock position and reinsert the set screw. The arm to column adjustment should now be checked. If the end of the arm can be moved up or down, then an adjustment needs to be made. Remove the rear cover plate and evenly tighten the top two 3/8 16 bolts until the arm is firm. There shouldn't be any movement in the arm when the miter arm lock is locked and unlocked. The bottom two nuts should be snugged evenly, but not as tight as the top two. The following adjustment is very critical. All future alignment procedures rely on this adjustment being performed correctly. There must be no looseness after this adjustment. Begin by indexing and locking the arm at 0 degrees. Now place a finger here, and with your other hand apply gentle side-to-side pressure on the end of the arm. Any side-to-side or rotational movement will be felt by this finger. If looseness exists, loosen the two Gibbs socket cap screws on the left side of the column support. Loosen each only half a turn. Now, raise and lower the arm. If the column tube binds while lowering and raising the arm, loosen these two bright-plated bolts, or if the tube moves to the side within the column support, tighten the same bolts until the movement disappears. Check all other bolts for tightness. Finally, tighten the socket cap screws until there's no rotational play between the column tube and support as shown previously. Raise and lower the arm again. If this movement is difficult, slightly loosen the socket cap screws. The carriage bearings, which are found by removing the cover on the left-hand side of the carriage, must now be checked for looseness. Loose bearings will cause inaccurate cuts. Slide the carriage to the rear of the arm and pinch the front bearing in this manner as firmly as possible. Pull the carriage forward. If you can stop the bearing from turning, it needs adjusting. Check the rear bearing in the same way. To correct any looseness, place a 1/2 inch wrench on the nut and hold it while using a 9/16 wrench to loosen the eccentric screw, just enough to let it turn. Rotate the screw, either left or right, to take up the looseness. Now, hold the screw still with the wrench and tighten its corresponding nut. Now, adjust the rear bearing if necessary. After this adjustment, you should not be able to stop the bearing from turning. The first stage in installing the front table requires adjusting the table supports. Begin by releasing the bevel lock lever, moving the bevel index lever to the left, and rotating the motor so that the arbor shaft points straight down. Tighten the bevel lock lever. Move the miter arm to a 50-degree miter position and then loosen the carriage lock knob. Move the arbor shaft over the table support. Place the arbor wrench handle on top of the support under the arbor shaft and lower the motor until the shaft is just touching the handle. you should be able to slide the wrench back and forth with only slight resistance. Now, tighten the end screw on the support. This screw is called screw A in the manual. Maintain the same elevation on the motor and swing the arm over the front screw, called screw B in the manual. Adjust the position of the support so that the wrench handle just slips between the end of the shaft and the support. Adjustment is made by loosening the screw and shifting the support up or down. Tighten the screw when you're finished. Now adjust the right-hand table support in the same way. Finally, recheck both supports to see that the tightening of the screws did not affect the adjustments. To install the front table, place the table on a work surface bottom side up. Note that the top side has counterbore holes. Now, hammer this T-nut into the leveling hole. This hole is the only one on the top side which is not counterbored. Next, snap the U-clip onto the front edge of the base so that the hole lines up with the hole just to the left of the center notch. Take the table and place it top side up on the table mounting support channels so that the center counterbored hole lines up with the hole in the U-clip. Drop a flat washer into the center counterbored hole and start a 1 3/4 inch pan head screw through the center hole and into the U-clip. Hand tighten only. Follow this with a cup point set screw placed in the leveling hole and into the T-nut. Do not fully tighten this screw. Flat washers and 1-inch pan head screws go in the remaining holes and through the matching holes in the table supports. Each screw requires a lock washer and nut and is tightened with a screwdriver. The middle table is placed on edge across the center of the front table. Now check for gaps between the two surfaces. A gap is fixed by either raising or lowering the center of the front table. To raise the center, tighten the cup point set screw against the frame. To lower the center, tighten the center pan head screw. When the gap is closed, the cup point set screw should be touching the frame like this, and the center pan head screw should be tightened. The alignment steps must be followed in the exact order outlined in the manual. We now must make sure that the radial arm is square to the fence. For this, a framing square is needed, and it must be checked to make sure that it is square. After reinstalling the saw blade, index, but do not lock, the arm at 0 degrees miter. Lock the yoke lock handle and the bevel lock lever. Now, lower the arm until the blade barely clears the table. Put the framing square on the table with one leg against the rear edge of the table. Move the square until the edge of it just touches a blade tooth. Mark this tooth, and then slowly move the carriage back and forth along the arm. The marked tooth should just touch the square at all points. If it doesn't touch the square, loosen these 3 set screws in the arm latch at the rear of the arm. Now, move the arm in the necessary direction to make the marked tooth follow the square when the carriage is moved back and forth. Lock the miter arm lock, retighten the 3 set screws, and recheck the movement of the blade along the square. Finally, set the miter indicator at 0 degrees. Now, the rest of the table can be assembled. Begin by laying down the fence, spacer table, and rear table. Tilt the clamp bracket forward and snap it into place in the opening found at the rear of each table support. Repeat this entire procedure for the other table support and tighten the thumb screws to clamp the table sections in place. The next check is to see that the blade is square to the table. Begin by lowering the blade until it just clears the front table. Lock the bevel, miter, rip, and yoke locks. Place the short leg of your square against the saw blade and the other parallel to the fence. Don't let the square touch a blade tooth. It must be flush with the blade. If there is a gap between the square and the blade, adjustment is needed. Start by removing the handle, which is held by a socket head screw. A 1/4-inch hex wrench removes the screw. Once the handle is removed, slightly loosen the 4 socket head screws seen here with a 1/4-inch hex wrench. Now, rotate the motor so that the blade is flush to the square, which must be held firmly at all times. Slightly tighten the 4 screws and recheck the blade for flushness. Tighten each screw, reinstall the handle, and adjust the indicator to the 0-degree reading. Last of all, loosen the rip lock knob. The blade now has to be made square to the fence. This will reduce the risk of kickback. Lower the blade until it just clears the table. Pull the blade forward to the front of the arm and lock the rip lock. Put the short edge of the square against the fence and the other edge against the blade, just under the blade collar. Don't let the edge touch any teeth. There should be no gap between the blade and the square. However, not all blades are perfectly flat. Check different points along the blade surface by making quarter turns and looking for gaps each time. If the overall fit of the blade shows no gap, then no adjustment is needed. If there is a gap, remove the left-hand carriage cover and loosen the yoke lock handle. Now, loosen the 2 hex head screws holding the yoke index pin. Rotate the yoke assembly until the gap is eliminated and lock the yoke lock handle. Retighten the 2 screws, check for blade squareness, and then reinstall the carriage cover. This next adjustment ensures that the blade is parallel to the table and thus reduces the chance of the workpiece being thrown or damaged. Begin by locking the arm in the straight crosscut position. Then pull the blade forward and lock the rip lock. Now, raise the blade at least 2 inches above the table and lock the motor at 90 degrees bevel. Put the long side of the square on the table under the blade, with the short side hanging straight down at the front of the saw. Lower the arm until the blade surface, not a tooth, rests on the square. If there is a gap, adjustment is needed, but remember that not all blades are perfectly flat. Check different points along the blade by making quarter turns and looking for gaps each time. Consider the overall fit of the blade before making adjustments. To correct a gap, unlock the bevel lock lever and loosen the rear motor mount nut until you can rotate the cam. Rotate the cam in this way until the gap is eliminated. Tighten the nut and bevel lock lever and recheck the blade for squareness. This next step is to install and adjust the rip scale indicators. Pre-assemble the 2 indicators with twin nuts and 6 32nd by 1/2 inch screws. The screws should be barely turned into the twin nuts. Loosen the 2 screws holding the left-hand carriage cover, but don't remove them. Tilt the cover and install the indicator on the inside of the cover. Now, tighten the carriage cover screws. Loosen the carriage cover screws and the rip lock knob on the right-hand carriage cover. Install the indicator and then tighten the cover screws. The fence should be in its normal position next to the front table prior to this next step. Loosen the yoke lock handle, pull the yoke index lever forward, and rotate the yoke to the left to index the yoke 90 degrees from the crosscut position. Lock the yoke lock handle. Now slide the carriage back until the edge of the blade just touches the fence. Now, lock the rip lock. If the indicator does not read 0 inches, loosen the cover screws and shift the indicator until it is aligned with the 0 mark. Retighten the screws. To adjust the indicator on the left-hand side, Move the blade to a position 2 inches away from the fence. The long leg on this framing square is 2 inches wide, but check to see if your square has the same width. With one edge touching the fence and the other touching the nearest blade tooth, lock the rip lock and adjust the indicator so that it indicates 2 inches on the upper portion of the blade outrip scale. The guard is one of the most important safety features on the saw. It is imperative that it be installed and be installed properly. Begin by locking the motor at 0 degrees bevel. Use one hand to lift the plastic guard clear and the other to hold the rear of the guard below the dust elbow. With the riving knife facing the front of the saw, tilt the front of the guard down about 45 degrees and place over the blade. Rotate the guard to a level position. Make sure the notch in the guard fits onto the tab on the motor. Now squeeze the handle trigger. If this action raises the clear plastic guard, the guard has been installed properly. If the guard won't raise up, remove and reinstall the guard, making sure that the trigger mechanism engages the pull link on the guard. Last of all, tighten the guard clamp screw securely. Our last alignment involves positioning the riving knife directly in line with the blade. With the saw in the in-rip position, lower the arm until the blade just clears the table. Unlock the rip lock, and while holding up the plastic guard, move the yoke back until the blade just touches the fence. Now, lock the rip lock. Loosen the Paul's riving knife knob. Lower the knife to the table and tighten the knob. The riving knife should rest flat against the fence. If it doesn't, loosen this riving knife bracket screw and slide the riving knife so it rests against the fence. Tighten the riving knife bracket screw. You have now finished assembling, adjusting, and aligning your radial arm saw. But before using it, go back through your owner's manual. Make sure you have completed each and every assembly, adjustment, and alignment procedure in the order shown. Make sure you've read and understood the safety and basic operating instructions and become familiar with the saw controls. Information and precautions on how to use your saw safely as you make various cuts is described in your owner's manual. Read and follow all the safety information found in your manual. Finally, remember that the adjustment and alignment of your saw is an ongoing task. The saw should be checked regularly, especially after heavy use, to see that the alignments are still true. From all the people who make the Ridgid products, we hope you enjoy your new Ridgid radial arm saw.